So good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me all right and all the technology is working. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. So we're talking all today about, I better just introduce myself quickly before I start. So my name's Greg Hopkinson. I'm Head of Business Development at Basis. And we wanted to do this webinar today to have a look at some of the impacts that the UK leaving the EU might have on legislation that impacts agriculture. Now I know it can be a challenging topic, and a bit of clarity will be really helpful with this. So we're really looking forward to presenting this today. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So I know you can all claim for our Basis professional register members, you can all claim 1 CPD point for attending this webinar. So if you signed up and with your email and logged in through a Microsoft account, then that's absolutely fine. We'll be able to record that. But if you had to sign into Microsoft anonymously, or you think you've had any issues on the sign in, I know it can sometimes it depends if you've got Teams downloaded on your computer or anything like that, then you should see there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, I think it is. And if you just put your 200 number into there, then we will record all them at the end of the session, and they'll be all uploaded onto your account, probably next week when it appears on your account. Yeah, we can record all that. So if you just put your 200 number into the Q&A box, then we'll make sure you get your CPD point allocated for attending today. Now that Q&A box is also a place for questions. So we've got 2 speakers today, but what we're going to do is we're going to go through kind of both presentations, and then we'll do a Q&A panel at the end. So I'll be kind of chairing that, and I'll be noting down everyone's questions as we go along. So if you think of any questions while our speakers are presenting today, then please just drop the questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do it as a bit of a panel discussion at the end. So the first thing I wanted to just cover quickly, and this is my only slide, you'll be pleased to know, so you haven't got to listen to me for too long today, is just what have Basis done in response to any changes to legislation following the UK leaving the EU. So obviously, understanding legislation that relates to plant protection products and the environment and fertilizers and agriculture more generally is a really integral part of a lot of our qualifications and courses. And so what we've had to do is we've had to actually update our syllabuses and our exam papers. And that's all been done now. All those syllabuses are available on the Basis website. So if you're thinking of doing a Basis course or have signed up for one for the next in the future, then have a look on the syllabus, and it'll in the kind of relevant module that focuses on legislation, it'll all be updated, and you can get a bit of a better understanding on what the requirements are for the exam. But some of the key changes we've made are, as a lot of you will know, a lot of EU legislation is kind of transposed into the UK with some specific regulations, and we're now kind of trying to avoid referring to the EU directives directly. So, for example, the Sustainable Use Directive, we're trying to focus on the actual specific regulations that apply in the UK. So, as for the plant protection product sustainable use regulations. We've also tried to provide a bit of clarity on the knowledge. So this is more specifically kind of for the certificate in crop protection courses and the plant protection award courses, those focus on plant protection products. We've tried to provide a bit of clarity on what the knowledge is that's required about the plant protection products approval process, and that applies for both. And as we'll talk about today, the differences also between the UK and Northern Ireland. And we've also, for all our syllabuses, tried to make it clear what understanding is required on EU legislation, as obviously some of that still applies in Northern Ireland, and all our Basis qualifications are applicable to advisors and farmers working in Northern Ireland. So there's a bit more clarity on that. But one important thing to remember is actually we think it's still really important that our candidates understand how EU directives have influenced UK legislation. And a really good example of that is the Water Framework Directive. There's quite a lot of legislation in the UK that has actually kind of been written into UK law due to the Water Framework Directive. So completely forgetting it and forgetting why we've got that in place and not having any understanding of it probably isn't the right way to go. So in our syllabus, we've kind of tried to explain what understanding of the original EU directives you still are required to have at the minute. And obviously, over time, as legislation changes and we gather more information, our syllabuses will continue to be updated. Now we've got two speakers today. We've got Adrian Dixon, who's going to cover the plant protection product side of it from CRD. And then we've got Jane Learmount from DEFRA, and Jane's going to be focusing a bit more on the kind of fertilizers and facts side of it. So we're really pleased to welcome Adrian and Jane today. Like I say, I'm going to let them provide all the information on the regulations because they're the absolute experts, and I'll speak to you all again at the end when we have the Q&A panel. So I'll pass over to Adrian now.
Thanks, Greg. Right, I shall now attempt to share my screen.
Okay, that's working for me. Perfect.
Excellent. It's not working for me though. Right, let's go back to the. So I'm Adrian Dixon. I head one of the operational policy teams in the HSE's Chemical Regulation Division. HSE is obviously the chemicals regulator for the UK, so that's where I fit in. What I want to talk about in this brief session is give you the structure of the legal framework and the changes to the legal framework, a little bit about sustainable use, and also some of the stuff around the future. This is how we like to look at the overall framework for the pesticides legislation. So we look at the pre-marketing areas, the use phase, and then the things that are around disposal and degradation. So of course for pre-marketing we have the whole authorization regulation, and I'll just put all the ones on because it'll make it easier to talk through. So there's the things that at authorization, all the conditions around authorization and approvals that come out of regulation 1107, and obviously also the maximum residue levels that are set as part of the authorization time out of regulation 396 of 2005. And then on the use phase, we have the Sustainable Use Directive, which I'll say a bit more about later on, and Greg's already given a mention. The Machinery Directive, which applied to new pesticides application equipment. And then at the end of it, we have things that affect the disposal of pesticides, what happens to them when they degrade and go into water, go into soil, so the whole issue of waste legislation, water legislation, and again the residues bit comes up at the end through the residues monitoring program and things. And then looking across all that at the minute, we've had the requirements of the statistics regulation and the whole how do we measure that we're getting a more sustainable use of pesticides. And then of course alongside all that there is a whole network of controls, some of which are done by HSE's enforcement officers, some of it is done by local authorities, so that overshadows the whole legislative structure. Just to talk a bit about the legislation themselves, what happened when we left, as we were leaving the EU, we basically took all the EU legislation and to use the phrase, we lifted and shifted it. So basically we turned it's a retained EU law now. So that's the stuff that we worked at in GB. The main things that we had to do in terms of the regulation was obviously, and all the legislation was take out all the references to EU institutions, things like the European Food Safety Authority, the European Commission, the references to member states, things like that. So all the legislation had to be corrected to make it specific to a GB situation. So we've got a number of exit statutory instruments, so that's secondary legislation that had to go through Parliament to do these corrections. And I won't run through the titles, but you've got them there for the record. but there's one that corrected 1107, the authorisations regulation. There's another one that corrected references to the Sustainable Use Directive and brought that into national law and other bits of implementing legislations. There was another one to correct the maximum residues levels regulation, so 396 was brought into GB law by amending it through that statutory instrument. And then, of course, with the whole sort of legislative process, as you might expect, there are little mistakes that pop up. So the first one did some corrected some cross-references. It also had to pick up additional EU decisions on active substances and MRLs that were working through the system as we were going through all this, bearing in mind that, you know, the exit process went on for a year or two. Then, of course, the fact that there was a change of exit day through the various negotiations, so that required another amendment to legislation. And then finally there was the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and again the change in the date for the transition period. So that all had to be brought into place in legislation. And then this year there will be a further statutory instrument laid, basically to pick up any EU decisions that have been made between that last piece of legislation that came into force and the end of the transition period at the end of December that's just gone. So hopefully that will then give us a comprehensive package of GB legislation. It's a bit of a nightmare to work through, but it is all on the gov.uk on the legislation part of that, so hopefully you can all find it and follow it through. Just to give you some overview of the changes to the system, we've now got a statutory active substance register which is published on the HSE website. You can find that as an Excel spreadsheet. So that's there of telling you what active substances are approved in GB. We are working on a GB review renewal programme, and that's a piece of work that we're pursuing as a matter of urgency. And of course we can review active substance approvals at any time if there's new evidence that identifies concerns to health, human health or the environment. But in the meantime, while we are actually working on a GB review programme, we have extended active substance approvals through the existing legislation, those that expired before December 2023, for 3 years to give us time to get this review renewal programme developed and operational. A little bit about how such a review programme might work. We obviously need a programme that's effective, manageable and proportionate, and that's efficient without significant additional resource to other review programmes. There are a number of ways that we could do this. We could make a lot more use of assessments by other regulators, or we could do more unilaterally. We could do it more targeted, and for example group active substances by class of chemicals or by types of legislation or by function, rather than just doing a straight chronological review as the EU programme works. But I think the critical thing is we will be seeking views on how the programme could work, so everybody will have a chance to give us their input. The other thing that we're looking at is how we might use applications and assessments in other jurisdictions. Obviously primarily now it's going to be the EU assessments will be the critical one, but we will decide whether assessments are suitable on a case-by-case basis. They will be GB decisions, and they will be made to the same regulatory standards as in the EU at the moment, because the legislation is the same. And until the requirements change, we would expect EU assessments to be considered relevant. And in all these cases, as now, applicants can make a case, applicants for authorisation can make a case as to why decisions from other jurisdictions are valid. So as I say, but the main thing is, you know, we will be taking independent decisions, and we've got an independent regulatory pesticides regime in GB. Product applications, there's been work done there so that existing authorisations carry on being valid in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Any product authorisations issued now will specify whether they're valid in Great Britain or Northern Ireland only, or both, so that it's clear for people who are using things and putting things on the market. And of course, now applicants for product authorisation have to have authorisation under both GB and Northern Ireland regimes to get access to both markets. But I think the important thing here is that there's no changes in data requirements or format at the moment, so there is that constant. We will of course try and maintain a common map number on the products where we can do, and allow common labelling, but there may be examples of divergence. So for example, as a result of changes to expiry dates in active substances, or if Great Britain takes a different decision to the EU, or if Great Britain makes a decision at a different time to the EU, they'll all sort of cause potential divergence. And of course, divergence could impact on conditions of authorisations, on data protection periods, and on map numbers. So the summary slide, effectively, the national regimes going forward, we're now operating an independent pesticides regulatory regime in Great Britain. So that's England, Scotland and Wales. We're taking responsibility for our own decisions on pesticides, and we're using our own rules, albeit the rules have been sort of lifted from the EU rules that we have at the minute. So that's the stuff on the statute book. But we have made sure that all existing active substance approvals, the product authorisations and maximum residue levels set continue to be valid in GB. And as I said earlier, authorisations for products are valid until their current expiry date, so that's carried on. Active substances approvals have been extended for 3 years, and we will set MRLs for GB based on our own assessments, but all existing MRLs remain valid until they're amended. And the other headline, of course, is that the Northern Ireland regime continues to follow all the EU rules under the Northern Ireland Protocol. A few slides around maximum residue levels. As I've already said, existing MRLs continue to be valid in Great Britain, and we'll set them based on our own assessments. New MRL applications will continue to be submitted in a similar format, and again, here in the MRL area, there'll be no changes in data requirements or the format for supporting information from applicants. So trying to keep things as sort of straightforward as possible to start off with. GB specific documents are available on the HSE website, and new MRLs and import tolerance applications will be assessed typically within 12 months. MRLs for new GB uses will be implemented at the same time as the decision on the authorisation, and temporary MRLs for emergency authorisations will be prioritised. So we obviously need to support, if there's emergency product authorisation applications that are dependent on having a temporary MRL, then we'll obviously need to have that as a priority. Some other things around MRLs, evaluation reports and reasoned opinions and decision documents will be published. MRLs again have been implemented by means of a statutory register, so there is the EU register of MRLs that applies for Northern Ireland, and there is a statutory register for GB. Supplementary information on MRLs, as before, should be submitted to HSE, and a formal MRL review programme will be implemented within 3 years. But as with the active substance provisions, we will review MRLs when we need to. So you will be seeing changes. You know, it's not just a matter of things staying static. But with all these things, we will try and make sure that those who are affected have as much warning as they can do. I just wanted to say a little bit while I'm talking about sort of some of the impact of the legislation on sustainable use and that wider picture. There are a number of wider strategies, of course, that play into the sustainable use of pesticides area. All of the administrations in UK have their own environment strategies. and they can all be found on different websites if you want to see the context and the direction of travel of these things. So the DEFRA 25-year plan, the Welsh Natural Resources Policy, and the Environment Strategy for Scotland and one for Northern Ireland. But then, of course, and as you'll have been hearing from the headlines around the climate conferences and things, there are all the measures around carbon net zero targets, which are obviously critical, and there are also domestic biodiversity targets. And then there's a whole international context of how we interact with other countries, and again you'll have seen lots more around that, and all the work that's going on trade agreements and things that all bites on these areas. The sustainable use legislation is still there and unchanged, and just to give you the headlines, what it's trying to do is get a sustainable use of pesticides by reducing risks and impact on health and the environment, and particularly promoting the use of IPM and of alternative approaches and techniques. And the legislation sets out the areas that we need to follow and the need for a national action plan. This is all followed through, as Greg mentioned at the outset, into the Plant Protection Product Sustainable Use regulations as well. And again, these requirements haven't changed on leaving the EU. Users have to have specified certificates, and CPD, continual professional development, is recommended. Sales of products, buyers have to make sure the end user holds a certificate, and distributors have to have certificates too to cover their activities. Application equipment, the general rule, if you can ride on it, you must get it tested, and of course there's the need for regular calibration. So none of that's changed on leaving the EU. Some of the more general areas, things about taking reasonable precautions. There's a need to demonstrate due diligence, use available guidance and minimise use of pesticides and apply things to the target, etc. Protection of water is still there as a high profile issue. There are tough standards that are still exist and carried forward that have to be observed. And IPM is still clearly a policy priority, and the 4 key principles of suppressing and monitoring, choosing the intervention and recording the outcome. So all those headlines are still there from a training perspective. Finally, just a few words around the whole how we do this sort of approach. You will be aware of the current UK National Action Plan, which was produced in 2013. Again, it can be found on the DEFRA website, and that's what the front cover of it looked like, just to show who was all involved. And hopefully many, if not all of you, will have seen that DEFRA, on behalf of the administrations, all 4 administrations, so that's all the UK administrations, has carried out a consultation on what a draft national action plan might actually look like, still having this high level aim of minimising risks and impacts to health and the environment, while ensuring pests and pesticide resistance are managed effectively. And the key goals of that, as you can see on that slide, so robust regulation is still a key goal, supporting development and uptake of IPM, sustainable and safe use of pesticides, reduction of risks associated with pesticides through improving metrics and indicators, and a lot of work going on in that in different areas, and ensuring that the government works effectively with all partners effectively to deliver the national action plan goals. So that work, that consultation has been done on that consultation document. DEFRA and the devolved administrations are now looking at the responses. The next step will be a sort of response to the consultation, and then the development of a new national action plan. So that's something to watch out for. So that's all I wanted to say at this brief session. Obviously my email address is there, but there is a lot of information on EU exit on the HSE website in different places, and I'm sure Greg and Basis in the various newsletters will have pointed you to those. So thanks for that, Greg.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Sorry, I was a little bit echoey then, but yeah, that was really interesting, and I think yeah, a really helpful overview of the changes to legislation. So I'm really pleased to also say we've got Jane joining us from DEFRA, and Jane's going to provide a bit more information on kind of the fertilizers and environmental side of changes to regulations following the UK leaving the EU. So I think Jane's just hopefully sorting a presentation out and just going through that, and then we'll hear from Jane. So like I said at the start, we'll have questions at the end. So I've got a few questions that have already come in, and I'm noting them down, and we'll have a bit of a panel session at the end. And the other thing is, for anyone who's joined late, like I said, if you would like to gain a CPD point, if you're a BASIS member, can I please ask you, can you put your 200 number into the Q&A box? Some people put their name, but we upload the data into our database. So if you put your name in, it probably will struggle to record it because it just picks the 200 number. So if you can please put your 200 number in the Q&A box, that's the best way to make sure that CPD point's allocated to your account. So Jane's got it all working. That was perfect. That's working for me. So I'll pass over to Jane.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thanks very much for inviting me here to present today. I thought I might actually start by telling you a little bit more about myself. I currently lead the fertiliser team at DEFRA, and I'm working in the Agri-Food Chain Directorate. I have quite a long history of work in this space, but I'm actually a scientist by training and have spent a fair amount of my career in government working with farmers to develop the evidence for more sustainable production. And this work on the ground on farms has been something that I've really enjoyed, and it's been really valuable in my role in the fertiliser policy team. So I wanted to talk to you today. I wanted to start off by giving you a bit of context to the fertiliser policy space at the moment, then look at product regulation, and then move on to look at some of our wider policy development. So, as I said, the fertiliser policy space is actually really interesting at the moment, and I don't want to kind of teach you to suck eggs, but I just wanted to underline why fertiliser policy is very interesting. It's actually a bit of an enigma. Without doubt, fertilisers are a really good thing. They're responsible for about 40 to 60% of the world's food production. And we've got a growing population. The world won't be able to meet its food production goals without them. But at the same time, they can be viewed as quite a bad thing. So inorganic production is quite energy intensive. It contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. We have negative impacts on water and air quality, and most types of fertilisers contain some types of contaminants. So organic fertilisers have, for example, metals and plastics in them, and mined phosphate fertilisers have heavy metals. So we have all of these things that we need to consider when we're thinking about policy development generally, and when we're thinking about how we're going to regulate. So at the moment, it's mainly the traditional inorganic mineral products that are regulated, and these really have the market share. So fertiliser product regulation review is really quite long overdue. It's not really kept pace at all with technological advances, nor with environmental pressures. And we're very aware at the moment, particularly leaving the EU, that refreshed policy can contribute to some of our quite pressing UK targets. So I've just listed some of those there. We have to reduce ammonia emissions by 8% by 2020 and 16% by 2030. We have to restore terrestrial and freshwater sites to favourable conditions. We're keen on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we have some quite tight targets. We need to reach net zero by 2050. We need to create and restore 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitats. All of England's soils need to be managed sustainably by 2030. And we have quite tight targets for waste. We want 65% of recycling for solid waste and less than 10% in landfill by 2035. And we want all plastic packaging being reusable, recyclable or compostable by 2025. And we're hoping to eliminate food waste to landfill by 2030. So there has in fact been some policy development that's been ongoing, and I'm sure you're all quite aware that the EU has been in the process of developing quite radical new regulations, and we have been round the table during those negotiations of the new regulations while we were part of the EU. The main objective of the new regulations is stronger environmental protection from contaminants, increasing the scope of fertilizers to include innovative new products such as biostimulants and soil improvers. And it's also really aiming to promote the circular economy by closing the loop between organic waste and fertilizers. And the whole system will become much more robust because obviously we will be accounting for more risky products. And so the intention in the EU was to use a conformity assessment framework to account for the different fertilizer types. So the EU fertilizer product regulation actually came into force in July 2019. And it has a 3-year staggered application, which means that it'll be fully in force in the EU in July 2022. However, it was not fully retained in UK law due to the timing of EU exit. And this leaves us with a bit of a problem of fragmented, outdated legislation in the UK. So what we have at the moment, actually, fertiliser regulation is quite unique. We had, while we were part of the EU, what we called a partially harmonised system. This meant that there was EU regulation that could bring products onto the market, but we also were allowed in all of the member states to retain our own domestic regulation. But in fact, our domestic regulation hasn't been updated since 1998. It was laid in 1991. And indeed, the EU regulation, which existed at the time, was last reviewed in 2003. So we have at the moment retained our domestic regulations. So we have those 1991 regulations. And as Adrian kind of neatly explained, we also lifted and shifted the EU regulation into UK law. And what we did was we removed all reference to European bodies and systems and pointed to UK bodies and systems to make it operable. But of course, with the incoming fertiliser product regulation, this EU regulation that we've retained will actually be repealed in the EU in 2022. So we also have some inoperable parts of the new FPR that we did retain, and I say inoperable because at the moment those still point to EU systems and processes that mean that they won't actually function properly in the UK. And Northern Ireland, which also had its own domestic regulation, retains the EU regulation under the Northern Ireland Protocol and will take the fertiliser product regulation from the EU in full in 2022. So hopefully by now you'll be totally confused and understand that we have quite a fragmented and difficult to navigate legislative framework in the UK operating at the moment. Because of these issues and because we wanted to decide where we wanted to go with UK policy, we actually retained a 2-year transitional period where we're accepting EU fertilisers with an EC marking. That's those products that are regulated under the EU Regulation 2003 for a 2-year transition period, and this will run out in December 2022. So a lot of problems, but actually also quite a good opportunity to take the best of the new fertiliser product regulation, but also develop it in a UK-centric way. So what we decided to do, recognising that this was a priority policy area from us as we moved away from the EU, is to take primary powers in the Agriculture Act 2020. What those powers do is expand the definition of fertilisers. So we're going away from the narrow definition of a fertiliser as a crop nutrient to a wider definition, which allows us to regulate products which actually improve a crop's ability to take up nutrients. We've also taken powers to embed new standards into regulation, and because we have assessed that the conformity assessment framework that was is going to be implemented by the EU is quite a good system actually. We've also taken powers which will enable us to introduce that into the UK as well. We've also taken powers which will allow us to improve labelling and market surveillance. So our future legislative framework is going to be shaped by public consultation. This ensures that the legal framework is fit for purpose, and our ambition really is to streamline the statute book so that GB does not end up with retained EU legislation which has been repealed in the EU, or outdated domestic rules that we really had left there running because we were part of the negotiation towards a better system. And we're hoping that this will give farmers the tools to respond to environmental changes. So this slide just shows you the timeline for our proposed regulatory reform. At the moment, we're focusing on drawing up consultation documents. We've done a period of pre-engagement with industry, and we are hoping to have consultation documents in place to publish by August this year. The consultation will run for 2 or 3 months. So it will end in October, and we will use the time between October and December to analyse the responses to consultation and decide on the future legislative framework that we want to adopt. We'll then use the time between December and May to actually develop and draft the secondary legislation that will bring those powers into being. And we're actually hoping to lay an SI in July next year, so that this is fairly well sequenced with what's going on in Europe, and that SI should come into force in about September. Now, of course, product regulation is not the only solution to better environmental management. And the Agricultural Transition Plan has recently been published by government, and this sets out the overarching changes that we're going to make to agricultural policy in England from the 1st of January 2021 this year. It also covers what those changes will mean for farmers and land managers. And between 2021 and 2028, we plan to do a range of things, which include introducing a new environmental land management scheme, rolling out a sustainable farming incentive from 2022. We are reviewing our productivity grant support. We have a commitment to investing in research, development and sustainability, to improving advice and guidance to farmers to help them make the right decisions for their particular circumstances. And we're hoping to replace EU scheme-based regulation and enforcement with a new and more effective and trusted approach. And so, as well as looking at product regulation at the moment, we're also looking at reviewing and again streamlining some of the downstream regulation around fertiliser use. So in reality, effective nutrient management and improved nutrient use efficiency and standard metrics to assess these are all key to delivery of not only our product regulation, but also our downstream regulation and all of those policy vehicles which will help to move and shift us towards a kind of greener environment for fertilizers generally. And I put this slide together just to give you an idea of how those policy vehicles interact with each other and how they can help us to achieve our overarching goal. So I'll give you a minute to just have a look at that. Now, as this is quite a complicated and cross-cutting policy landscape, we're working very closely with our colleagues in the water quality, air quality, soil health, waste and resource and agriclimate teams to ensure that we have, kind of really joined up thinking. We break down the silos and make sure that all of our policy development as well as our product regulation doesn't have unintended consequences. To ensure that our policy making is robust, we've set up a nutrient management expert group. And this group brings together experts across the board in water, air and soil quality. We've got experts in circular economy who have particular interest in how we deal with waste. We have social scientists on board and also members of the farming community. To keep the discussions really well grounded, we've also set up a sector sounding board, and this is widely represented by the farming and manufacturing industry, as well as appropriate NGOs. And the group has a rolling 16-month programme, at the end of which they'll come up with recommendations for optimal policy to minimise fertiliser pollution while accounting for pollution swapping. So in reality, that group will be publishing those recommendations in about between September and December, and so they will also feed into our consultation responses and help us to form up our new product regulations. We're already aware of some policy gaps, and there are some things that areas where we might want to diverge from the UK, from the EU, particularly around standard settings and perhaps labelling. So we've already commissioned a programme of research. We've got a study ongoing that looks at fertiliser contaminant levels broadly across all fertiliser product types. We have a programme of work understanding the environmental footprint of enhanced efficiency fertilisers. So these are some of the new products that will be brought into scope by the FPR and include things like inhibitors, biostimulants and slow release fertilisers. We're looking at available and new technologies to reduce plastics in digestate. Digestate will itself be brought into scope of the new fertiliser product regulation, and we're hoping to follow the same kind of model in the UK. But plastics are a huge issue in digestate, so we're looking at technologies that would enable us to remove plastics from the feedstock and also filter them out of the end product, and also measure their presence more effectively, so that we have good standards for the product regulation to adhere to. We have an ongoing study that's looking at technologies to mitigate the environmental impacts of digestate use as well. Digestate is being promoted, or anaerobic digestion is actually being promoted in the UK at the moment as one of our solutions to green energy. But of course we need to have something that we can do with the end product, and actually digestate gives us other issues around ammonia emissions, for example, and reducing water quality. And we've very recently published a review of available software tools for nutrient management planning, with the objective of looking at whether we can harmonise or better criterise the type of planning tools that are available to farmers. And what we would hope to do is expand the programme based on evidence gaps, which will be identified by MMEG, but also by our consultation process for better regulation. So that kind of brings me to the end of what I wanted to say today. And in summary, regulatory review is underway with consultation expected in the summer and new legislation expected next year. What we're hoping to do is modernise product regulation and streamline the statute book, but also give farmers a broader range of greener tools and the confidence to use them. What we're also hoping to do is smooth the route to market for more innovative green products and really shift away from the traditional, more polluting mineral and inorganic products. And as I hope you're aware now, this is all part of a wider initiative to make improved nutrient use efficiency more accessible and much more straightforward for farmers. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think I'm going to pass back to Greg, who hopefully will be capturing any questions that you have, and Adrian and myself will be here and very happy to answer them.
Thanks, Jane. And I'm going to just share my screen again, and like you say, we'll have we've got lots of questions for both you and Adrian, so we're just going to go through those now, if that's okay. But that was a really good overview, and it sounds like yeah, very positive going forward, hopefully. Anyway, so I'm going to start with a couple of questions for Adrian, if that's okay. And one that's come up quite a lot actually is about the expert committee on pesticides and what their role is going to be. So a few people have asked kind of what will they be doing? Will the authorization of plant protection products still be down to the expert committee on pesticides, or will it be a broader CRD framework, or what's their role going to be in the future?
I think that's really good questions. I think the first thing to emphasise that the expert committee on pesticides, just like its predecessor, the advisory committee on pesticides, have never actually taken decisions on pesticides. They are only there to provide scientific advice to the decision makers. The decision maker is primarily HSE, although depending on, because we have the responsibility delegated through agency agreements from the 4 departments. So, you know, that's where the decision sits. So ECP's role is in terms of advice. As the questioners have probably picked up, there is a whole lot more advice to do now that we've got our own active substance approvals to do and things like that, and that will all be going through the ECP system. So new processes have been developed. The sort of capacity and capability of the committee has been increased. And there's a lot of work being done on sort of trialing how the ECP would give scientific advice on active substance approvals alongside the public consultation process that goes with it. So that's what the ECP's work is, basically there to provide scientific advice to HSE and the rest of government on pesticides issues. And that's sort of as it was before. The main thing is that they will have a lot more things to provide advice on going forwards, I think, is the summary. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, and the second most popular question we had was actually for me, because just before we have any more questions for anyone else, is a lot of people have asked, will this webinar be available afterwards? Yeah, this is all being recorded and it'll go up on the Basis YouTube channel. So if you just go on YouTube and search Basis Reg, then you'll be able to find it probably up next week, if that's okay. So if anyone wants to look back or check anything or anything like that, refer back to it at all, then yep, it'll all be available on our YouTube channel. So the other question is, I'm going to stick with committees, and we had a question about the pesticide residues in food committee. Are they going to have a similar role? And also, are they still going to be working with the EU on monitoring processes, or will it be more UK focused?
Yeah, no, that's another very good question. I mean, the expert committee on pesticide residues in food, which is the sort of PRIF's full title is still in existence. Its role really is looking at the monitoring results from sort of the monitoring program that we present to them and advising on that. So that role will continue. As the questioners have picked up, of course, we have a sort of a double monitoring program to do now, or to work out between us. So we have a GB monitoring element, and there will also be a sort of a Northern Ireland element. The Northern Ireland element will be contributing to the EU monitoring programme, but the GB information won't necessarily. So the monitoring programmes will continue. They will sort of still have their focus on looking at sort of the types of things they look at, but how they feed back into the systems are different. But as I've said, the expert committee still sits there sort of looking at the data, looking at the monitoring results, and indeed advising on priorities for monitoring and things like that going forward, and providing its sort of expert advice in that area. Thanks.
Okay, and so we'll go for a question for Jane next. A lot of the questions for you, Jane, we're kind of focusing on Northern Ireland. So you've spoke a lot about how we're going to develop this new legislation and new frameworks, but obviously Northern Ireland is still going to have to follow EU legislation. So how's that going to look, and how's that going to work?
Well, I guess the thing that we're reasonably fortunate about is that EU regulation in the fertiliser space, as I hope I kind of alluded to and you picked up, is partially harmonised. So member states are allowed to retain their own domestic regulations as well. So at the moment, we work really closely with the devolves. Fertiliser policy is devolved. It's transferred in Northern Ireland, but there is the opportunity that we could produce one streamlined set of legislation that was our GB policy that could also become the domestic regime for Northern Ireland. Obviously, you know, in this whole review, we are looking towards the FPR as the kind of model for GB. It's a well thought out piece of legislation. It encompasses a wide number of products that we do want to bring into scope, and the conformity assessment framework that it will sit under is actually a really good system. It enables less risky products to be self-certified and more risky products to be third-party certified, which is really good. So we are hoping that the two systems, the EU system and our new GB system, won't be dissimilar. Some of the thoughts that we're having at the moment are around standard setting and whether we want those to be the same, but the fundamental framework may be very similar. But as I say, there's still the option that Northern Ireland could have the new FPR and then have our new domestic regime as their new domestic regime. Their domestic regulation at the moment is also very outdated. It was developed in 1992.
Okay, so an example of that, I mean, one other question that's come up is, obviously there's been a lot of talk about ammonia emissions and the regulations around that, and the regulations around urea and the use of urea as well. Yeah. So how could that look? Is it likely is that in domestic legislation, or could it be that it could be banned or restricted use in Northern Ireland and different regulations in the rest of GB?
At the moment, we're considering the urea consultation in the scope of England. But that's not to say that we might develop something, you know, with the devolved administrations that looks similar.
So that's a devolved decision. So right,
it's a devolved decision, yeah. But as I say, I mean, fundamentally in the UK, up to the present time, fertiliser policy has been really harmonised operationally, and we see no reason to want to move away from that. But it's why public consultation is really a crucial step in any regulatory reform. There's quite a lot to actually tease out. in terms of trade and environmental issues. I've tried to give you in 15 minutes a whistle-stop tour through the complexity of the policy landscape of fertilizers. And actually at the moment, regulation of fertilizers is quite poor, I would say. They're not very well regulated at all.
So it's an opportunity to improve, and like you say, when you've got trade thrown into it as well, it can make it fairly. It does complicate it more. But no, that's fair enough. So I'll go back to Adrian. You've already got five more minutes of questions. But another thing that I know a lot of people will be interested in is ERMUs or EMUs or however you want to pronounce it. So the extension of authorisations for minor use. Will the process for that be similar? Are we still going to have ERMUs in the UK? And if we are we likely to see any delays in the applications for them?
Yeah, I mean, the whole EMU process, that's how we pronounce it, is EMUs, will carry on as it is. So, that just carries on. So I don't think there should be any specific issues around there. Some of it might be affected by some of the sort of product reauthorizations, renewals and things like that, just as it would have been in the past. But as I say, I mean, it's probably worth pointing out that our main aim is that, ideally everything should be through sort of substantive authorizations where it can be, rather than EMUs and emergency authorizations and things. But those processes still continue anyway. Thanks.
And I've got one more quick one for you. I hope this one is quite a simple one. So you've spoke about this 3-year extension for those products. Can we just clarify, does that mean 3 years added on for every product, or is that just 3 years kind of from now? So if you had a product that was approved till 2024, does that mean that that's now approved till 2027, or how's that working?
It is a very complicated one and probably needs a bit more explanation. But I mean, the main point was sort of extending the active substance authorisations and other things moving along underneath it. So I don't know whether the questioner wants to drop you a more specific sort of email, perhaps separately, and then we can sort of give a more detailed answer that you can then share more widely, perhaps. Greg, thanks.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I think we'll probably put a summary of this event as a bit of a news article on the BASIS website, and we'll do some of the key questions and answers in the article. So I'll email Adrian after. Hopefully he'll send me a bit of a description over, and we can put that into the news article on the website for everyone to browse in their free time. So I'll try and I'm just going to squeeze in one more question each, if that's all right. So Jane, I've got a question actually. I saw you mentioned kind of nutrient management plans and farm nutrient budgets on your kind of overall slide with all the different bubbles interacting with each other. How are they going to fit into legislation? Can we see that being part of kind of the ELMS scheme, or will that be kind of more written into fertilizer regulations?
So at the moment, there's a real will for us to try and be as efficient as possible in using all of the policy levers that we have. Actually, we are also reviewing the downstream regulations. So at the moment, nutrient management planning is mandated in law under the Farming Rules for Water and nitrogen vulnerable zones. So what we're looking at is how we can kind of improve that. There is an acceptance that actually that hasn't worked very well. I think at the moment, according to the British Survey of Fertiliser Practice, only about 57% of farmers say that they actually use a nutrient management plan, and whether we really have a coherence across the farming industry as to what a nutrient management plan looks like. So we're grappling at the moment with how we want to tackle that to make things better. And it may be that, well, we're certainly looking at nutrient management planning under the Environmental Land Management Scheme, but we're also looking at how we might better mandate that in regulation as well.
No, that's really interesting. Obviously, with BASIS's role and our facts qualified advisors, but that'll be really interesting to members how that's going to be mandated because a lot of our members play a key role in kind of developing those nutrient management plans. So that's really good. And I've got one last quick question for you, Jane. Hope this is easy. So you mentioned the nutrient management group.
Yes.
Is the list of members published anywhere? Can anyone find that, or not?
I'm happy to make that available. We didn't actually thought about publishing a little web page about the MMEG, and it wasn't that we we wanted to not make it transparent. It was just the fact that it probably would have taken as long to set that up as the group ran. So happy to make that available. I don't think it's actually published anywhere, but it's certainly in the public domain. Quite happy to make that transparent, so I can send that to you, Greg, if you want.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have one last question, Adrian, before we go, and just squeeze one in. So buffer zones, obviously at the minute on all the products that are approved in the UK, there's a plethora of different buffer zones, whether it's drift reduction technology or arthropod. How do you see those going forward? Is that going to be simplified, or we're going to be using similar to what we've got at the minute?
We have been working for a little while on sort of certainly on the aquatic buffer zones of trying to bring it all together, and there's a good deal of work going on behind the scenes around the scientific elements of that. And separately, we're looking at the non-target arthropod buffer zones, whether we can increase them a little bit to make things better. So there is work going on that, and we will obviously keep yourselves in basis and others sort of informed of that developing, so that you can keep members up to date, Greg.
That's great. So as you're developing your new kind of processes, that's at the forefront of your mind. That's great to hear. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I think we've covered most of the questions. Like Adrian said, if anyone's got any further questions, then you should be able to get I'll just put up my last slide, then you get my contact details as well. So my email and things are just on there. So if anyone's got any further questions, then either drop an email directly to Jane or Adrian. You should be able to get their email addresses from the webinar video, or drop them to me, and then we'll try and get something put together onto the BASIS website as a news article that kind of summarises the key points made today, answers a few of those key questions, and provides a link to the webinar for others to watch. And I'd also say, I know it's a beautiful sunny day, so a lot of our members will be, and it's a busy time of year for a lot of our members. So if anyone thinks that they've got any colleagues or other people they know who might be interested in watching this, then just point them in the direction of the BASIS YouTube channel, and they should be able to catch up from there. So thanks again for joining, and I hope you can join us again when we next run a webinar at BASIS.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg.